So last week we've had 2 classes on scheduling. We started with uniprocessor scheduling, then we looked at what operating systems need to do to schedule multiprocessors or multi-core systems. Then we generalized that and looked at distributed scheduling, how jobs are scheduled across a set of machines in a distributed system, a collection of servers or perhaps a collection of workstations. We did several case studies at the end on the V system from Stanford, very brief case studies. This V system from Stanford, the Sprite operating system from Berkeley. I talked about volunteer computing, and I talked about the Condor system for distributed scheduling. Okay. I will put up some pointers to some of these papers. They are classical papers. If you are interested in learning more, there's also some material in the book on some of these systems. Okay, so I do urge you to go and look at all of that material and bring yourself up to speed, at least those who couldn't come to the makeup class. So we are going to continue the discussion and start talking about virtualization today. Okay. So slight change of topic, but it's still broadly related to threads, processes, scheduling, resource management, and things like that. I will also have a handout on this topic posted to Moodle soon. This is not material directly taken from the textbook. It's a material I've drawn from other sources. So I'll have a handout which actually has all of the details that I'll talk about. We'll post that to Moodle shortly. Okay. So let me start with the definition of virtualization. So we'll start with a very straightforward definition. Okay, so virtualization is basically the ability to replace one interface using another. Okay, so you're using basically one interface to mimic the behavior of another interface. Okay, that's a very simple and very general definition. It doesn't actually say how to do it. It simply says what is done. Okay, and that is shown in this picture here. So here is machine A. Okay. It runs hardware A, okay, which would be the instruction set or the architecture of the machine, and it provides an interface A. Okay, that's a software interface A to some program. Okay, that's basically the initial scenario. Now, if you use a machine B, okay, which has a different hardware or a different software or both, okay, and then you use the interface exported by machine B, okay, and write a software layer on top which takes that interface B and mimics this original interface A. Okay, so that's what is shown here. So you have an implementation that takes the interface B and mimics the original interface A, and then the program actually runs on that interface A as if nothing has changed. Okay? So you're using one interface to mimic the behavior of another interface. Okay? That's basically at a very high level what it means, and what we will do for the rest of the class is understand why should you ever do something like this. Okay, why do you want to mimic one interface using another, and also what is actually done, okay, in the virtualization layer. The software layer that is mimicking one interface with another is the virtualization layer. Okay, and we'll see how that is built, what is actually been happening inside to do this in some reasonable way. Okay. So let's start with a little bit of history. Okay, so virtualization, although you hear about it a lot these days, is actually a very old technology, almost 40 years old. Okay, it was introduced by IBM in the 1970s. Okay. And the way it came about was sort of evolved out of the natural progression of technology trend. Okay, so IBM in those days was in the business of selling expensive mainframe computers to business clients. Okay. These machines would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars or millions of dollars. Okay. And so you can think of a large company like a bank, insurance company, or some such company that's bought an expensive piece of machine hardware from a vendor like IBM, and it's written some applications that run on top of that machine. Okay. This could be business applications of any sort. Okay. Now let's say after a few years the machine becomes old. Okay, so and then every few years as technology improves, machines become outdated, you purchase another new machine to replace the old one. Okay. Now clearly IBM uh, also took advantage of improvement in technology trends and came up with new versions of their mainframe products and so on. Okay. But as they did that, they introduced new hardware features, they introduced new instruction sets for their CPU, they also introduced new features into the operating system, or changed the operating system to run on the newer hardware. So now from a customer's perspective, if you say, okay, 5 years ago you spent $1 million, you bought a machine. Now it's time to replace it. Here is a brand new one. It is much better than the old one. It's faster, it's better in many different ways. So now you can write a check for another $1 million, buy this new machine. Okay? And by the way, all of the applications that you had written previously, none of them will work anymore because the hardware has changed, the OS has changed. So you should now think about how you're going to code this application. Okay, so now it's one thing to buy a new piece of hardware, but it's another to take a lot of the labor and effort you've invested in building your applications and now they don't work anymore. Okay? And it's a substantial amount of effort to retool those applications to again port them to some new hardware. Okay? People time is expensive. Okay? If you want to rewrite, hire 100 people to rewrite all your application, that's going to be several million more dollars in addition to the hardware you buy. So you don't necessarily want to do that. Okay? So what they did was they sort of came up with this idea saying, let us have some sort of a portability layer that will allow old applications to run as if nothing has changed. Okay? And that is basically what the virtualization layer did. So although their mainframe architecture and OS had changed, they introduced this layer to ensure backward compatibility or portability. So what that layer simply did is it basically emulated the old OS and the old hardware, even though it was running on something that may be completely different, new CPU or new OS. So now this is a much better way to sell your product, saying, okay, a machine is outdated, we have a much better product now. Okay? It's still going to be expensive, but by the way, nothing that has to do, that used to run on the old machine has to be changed. It will run unmodified on the new machine. Okay? It's much easier. Then all you need to do is move your data, move your code, and you just start the applications up. They continue to run. Okay? Now these ported applications will not be able to take any advantage of the new features, okay? But they will run unmodified. Okay? They don't have to be changed at all. Okay, and any new applications that you write, you will actually write them to the new interface B to take advantage of the newest features. But anything that was previously written to any old hardware would continue to run. Okay, so that's basically the way they came up with this notion of virtualization, and clearly that kind of message is much better than telling someone saying nothing is going to work from your old machine, everything has to be redone. Okay? So that's the brief history of how virtualization came about. So they invented this layer that would mimic the old hardware and the old software using the new hardware and the new software. Okay? Now for many years, many decades rather, that is all that virtualization was used for. It was sort of a portability layer that you came with your large expensive mainframe. But then several technology trends have now made this really a mainstream technology, which is why we are even having a lecture on this topic. Okay, so now we'll talk about what virtualization is being used for today, how does it work, and so on and so forth. Any questions on this history? Is it clear what we mean by emulating one interface with another? Okay. So, the definition was somewhat general for a reason. Okay, because there's not one type of virtualization, but many types of virtualization. And this depends on what hard interface you are emulating. So you could actually take one hardware, okay, and emulate some other hardware. Okay. In this case, you are going to get hardware level virtualization. Okay. You could take one OS interface. Okay, in this case, the interface at the hardware level, the interface is the instruction set, the CPU. Okay, so you are using one instruction set to emulate another instruction set. So that's hardware level virtualization. If the interface you are trying to mimic, okay, is one OS interface mimics another OS interface, that's OS level virtualization. Okay. You could of course mimic at the application level one interface using another. That's application level virtualization. Okay, JVM or Java Virtual Machine is application level virtualization. Okay, it is basically exporting an abstract Java virtual machine interface at the application level. Okay, so you have virtualization technologies at all of those levels. Okay, we look at some of them. Hardware level, OS level, application level. Typically when somebody says virtualization, in most cases they by implicitly mean hardware level virtualization. But that does not have to be the case. As OS level and application level virtualization as well. Okay, is that clear? So there are different interfaces at different layers of the hardware and software stack. So depending on what interface you are using to emulate another one, there are different types of virtualization. Okay, so we'll start with hardware level virtualization, and even within hardware level virtualization, we will see that there is a spectrum of techniques or technologies that are used to perform, rather mimic the interface. Okay? So we'll start with the most basic one. This is referred to as full emulation. Okay? In this case, the virtualization layer is referred to as a virtual machine because you are actually emulating another machine, okay, at the hardware level. Okay? So the virtual machine essentially emulates or simulates an entire another machine in software. Think of it as a software emulation of a PC. Okay. All the functionality of the PC is implemented in software. There is a software implementation of a CPU, just as there's a hardware CPU, emulate a CPU in software. You can emulate a disk in software. You can emulate a network interface card like an Ethernet card in software. All of this emulation is actually happening in software. What that means is all the functions that the hardware is performing is emulated or simulated in software. Okay? Often using the actual hardware underneath. Okay? Sometimes you cannot simulate something without having some real piece of hardware backing it underneath. So you can't simulate a software disk without having a storage medium. So the data has to be stored somewhere. So the software disk will be emulated, or the virtual disk will be emulated using a physical disk. But it's a implementation or software implementation of what a disk would do in terms of reading and writing data. Okay? But what full emulation essentially does is, since it's a complete emulation, you can use it to emulate any machine you want, any CPU you want, using any other machine or any other CPU. Okay? In particular, you can take one family of instruction set or CPUs and emulate another one. That's a very popular use of full emulation. Examples are, if you have heard of Box, which is an open source software. Okay, it's a piece of software that emulates several dozen different CPUs. Okay? It runs on x86, so it's using your typical PC. Okay, there's a program that runs on a PC, but it emulates a variety of different types of CPUs. There is QEMU, which is also related to Box. But this is a good example to keep in mind. This is a software product that Microsoft used to sell until recently, called Virtual PC for the Mac. So until about 5 years ago, okay, Macs were not x86 based. Okay, they used to run a processor family called PowerPC. Okay, different instruction set, okay, different CPU. Okay, so you can't just run x86 code on PowerPC. And Macs would basically be PowerPC based. So clearly that means that any application that is compiled for x86 is not going to run on PowerPC machine. So what Microsoft did is they built this virtualization layer called Virtual PC. It emulated a x86 PC on a underlying PowerPC PC. So a PowerPC Mac in this case. Okay? So it basically looked like a x86 PC completely implemented in software. And basically, so what that means is, if your application that's running executes an x86 instruction, okay, that virtual PC software will take that x86 instruction and execute an equivalent set of PowerPC instruction. So if there is a move instruction or some add instruction, let's say at an assembly level, okay, clearly the instruction sets are different, but there's an equivalent instruction in the PowerPC world. So you would take each of those instructions, and whenever that instruction is executed, you then basically go and execute the equivalent instruction on PowerPC or the equivalent set of instructions. Okay? That is meant by full translation. It's like think of it as a language translator. Somebody is talking in French, the translator is taking every sentence and translating it in English. Okay? So there's equivalent words are being substituted. Right? The same thing is happening. So what this allows you to do by this selling this virtual PC product, you could actually run Windows unmodified on your PowerPC Mac. That was basically the reason, and lots of people needed to use some Windows software. So rather than buying another machine, you could buy this piece of software, you could run your Mac applications, and when you need to run any Windows application, you run virtual PC, you boot Windows in that machine, and then you run your Windows application. So that's basically how you do it. Okay? So it's a full emulation. What that also means is it's inherently going to be very slow, because you're taking an assembly instruction by assembly instruction, doing a translation, and then executing the corresponding instruction on the PowerPC architecture in this case. Okay? So that translation is going to be very slow. So it will slow down your Windows application some, but at least you can run them. Okay? That's full emulation. That's the sort of the simplest form of virtualization technology. What that also says is you can essentially use this kind of technology to emulate any other hardware you want. It's going to be slow because you're going to have to do instruction level by instruction level mappings and so on. Okay. Next type of technique we'll see, which is also hardware virtualization, is referred to as native virtualization. In native virtualization, okay, so what you're doing is the interface that you have, okay, that machine interface B, and the interface you're emulating, which is machine interface A, are one and the same. Okay, so here, okay, well, let's say in the virtual PC for Mac, this was a PowerPC interface B. A was an x86 Intel x86 interface. Okay, so they were different. In native virtualization, the interface A and interface B are exactly the same. So you will emulate, let's say, x86 PC on another x86 PC. That would be an example of native virtualization. Okay, the A and B are the same interfaces. Okay, is that clear what native virtualization is? Okay, so then you may ask, why would you ever bother in emulating the same interface if you already have it with you? If you want to emulate some other interface, I think we have made a case that you may not have the hardware, or the hardware may be old. But why would you ever do native virtualization? Why do you want to emulate the same interface in the virtualization layer?
Underlying layer might be very a beefy machine, and you need to split it across.
You want to split a machine across others?
To simulate an environment, basically, when you want to run your application, whatever you want to do in a certain environment, and for that you are not going to buy another machine that facilitates that environment. You can basically just create that environment on a virtual machine.
Okay, so you can create an environment that you want inside a virtual machine, rather than buying another machine to run that environment. So another way to think about this is, although it's x86 on x86, you have choice of running a different OS. Okay, you can run Linux on Windows. Okay, now Macs are also x86, so you can run Windows on Mac. Okay, so the same use case or virtual PC still exists. The operating systems don't have to be the same. Okay, they could be different, because both of those run on x86 machines, but rather than buying two, you can run the second one inside a virtual machine. All of the other scenarios that I mentioned are also true, that you may actually run Windows on Windows, but that other Windows OS may have, the virtual machine may have an environment, let's say, to do testing of code that you're writing. So you don't want to have the code crash and mess up your original machine, so you run it inside an isolated virtual machine. Okay, so there are many scenarios where you may want to recreate some other environment, or you may want to run another OS. So you are going to use native virtualization, create a virtual machine, and then run another OS, or you can even run the same OS, but maybe some other application environments may run inside. Okay. The nice thing about native virtualization is it's significantly faster than emulation, because you're running the same, you're emulating the same interface. So when an x86 instruction is executed, let's say inside a x86 virtual machine that's running on top of a real x86 PC, you don't have to do any translation. Okay, you just send it to the CPU for execution. There's nothing to translate, it's the same instruction. Okay. Here you would have to take the second one. Okay. that is going to be somewhat slower than basically taking an instruction and sending the same instruction down to the hardware for execution.
Why was it so difficult to do native virtualization initially? As in why was I believe that VMware was the first to do such a thing. Like native virtualization.
Question is, why was it hard to do native virtualization? VMware was not the first to do native virtualization. IBM had this technology as well, which allowed you to actually do the other use case that we have not yet discussed, which is take a large server and make it look like lots of small servers.
The concept was first done by on x86 by VMware, right?
IBM used to have this kind of technologies back in the 80s or 90s, where you took a large mainframe and made it look like lots of small
But it was for
machines.
mainframe, not for x86, right?
Yes, but it is still hardware native virtualization, just using the same interface using another interface. That's the definition. x86 is a different use case.
This is a hardware virtualization.
Yes.
So then what will be the difference between the operating system virtualization and the hardware virtualization?
Okay. Question, what's the difference between hardware and OS virtualization? I will come to OS virtualization in the next slides, and we will discuss what we do is that's different. Okay. So native virtualization basically says it's the same underlying virtual machine, not virtual machine, interface. So it's much easier to do the run the code, but you may still have to simulate some hardware, like the disk. The memory may have to be virtualized, the disk, the network interfaces may have to be emulated, and so on. Okay, so you only need to emulate those. The rest of it is much easier. And there are lots of different products that are available from VMware, Parallel, VirtualBox. Okay, if you use any of those, or there's IBM has its own set of products that do native virtualization. Okay. Next up is a technology called para-virtualization. Okay, I'll come back to para-virtualization and show you a figure that shows how this is done. So here the virtual machine doesn't directly simulate hardware, but it requires some modifications to the OS in order to run on this specialized virtual machine. Until now, okay, in full emulation or native virtualization, we assume that the software that's running on the virtualization layer is unmodified. Okay? It's the same software that you had run on the actual hardware, you just run it without changing it at all. Okay? You don't change Windows just because you run in the VM. Okay? It runs, the same code runs. Okay? But there are special scenarios where you can make some small changes to the operating system, okay, in order to run it on the virtual machine. If you use this kind of technique, and we'll see why that even makes sense in just a little bit, okay, you have what is called as para-virtualization. Okay, so there is a Zen Zen virtual machine monitor is an example of a para-virtualized technology. Okay. Old versions of ESX Server, okay, which is VMware's flagship virtualization product, also used para-virtualization. But this requires OS level changes, which means you have to work with the OS vendor to make sure it runs. Okay, if you want to para-virtualize Windows, you can't do it. You have to work with Microsoft, which builds Windows, to say, can you modify it in such and such way so it runs. Okay, so without that, you will not be able to para-virtualize. Okay. Next is OS level virtualization. Okay, what OS level virtualization does is it basically emulates one OS interface using another. Okay. Same use cases apply. Okay. You built your application to run on, let's say, Linux 2.4 kernel. Okay. Some OS calls changed subsequently. So the code is not going to run unmodified on Linux 3.x kernels because some small system calls were changed, and so it needs to be ported. Okay. So one way is then you use Linux 3.x, use OS virtualization and present a 2.x interface. Okay. That way old code will basically, so essentially you are emulating the old system calls using the new system calls. Solaris does this. When you actually run Solaris, you can say when this application runs, present it some old system call interface from an earlier version of Solaris. That way the code doesn't have to change because you've changed the system call interface in newer versions. Okay? That's one use case for OS level virtualization. So here nothing really has changed other than the interface looking like the old interface. Yeah, that's, you're only emulating system call interface. There's nothing being done underneath. The OS still runs on its own hardware and so on. Okay. Second use case is to provide resource isolation. Okay, you can essentially provide the notion of a smaller virtual server that gets its own copy of the OS that runs on the old OS. Okay. So essentially, so let's say that's the machine here, and that's the hardware, that's the OS kernel. So you can create things called something called a virtual server. Okay, what that is like a resource container. Okay? So the processes that are running here, applications, cannot see or access processes that are running in other containers. So they are isolated. Okay? So it looks like this process sees the OS, but it doesn't see anything else. Okay? So you can also isolate the disk and say within this container you can only access this partition but not other partition. Okay? So this is often used for resource isolation. Okay? You can even allocate some CPU to this container, saying this container gets 20% of the total CPU. Okay? So if the machine, the OS, the application tries to ask for more, it is going to be capped at that level. Okay? So it provides performance and resource isolation. So you can take your machine and then create smaller virtual servers on them. Okay, each of those virtual servers look like an independent machine. It's just the same machine. It's the OS pretending like this is its own OS, and it just simply does this by creating a partition. Anything in one partition cannot see what is happening in the other partition. You can't see those processes. You may not be able to see the disk partitions in the other partitions and so on and so forth. But otherwise, it's the same OS. Okay, you don't have another copy of the OS necessarily. Okay, does that answer your question? You had asked.
Absolutely.
Okay, so
What I understood was like your OS is that versioning of like Linux 2.0 can run on Linux 2.3.0, so you are giving a compatibility support there. So the application that needs to run on Linux 2.0 can run on Linux 3.0.
Right.
Now, that's. So I got that part, but the guest OS is the same as the host OS, but appears isolated. Is it like so we don't have any we don't have any other OS layer on top of it, right?
Yeah. So I will draw a picture just to make this a little more explicit. So in native virtualization, let's say x86, you have a virtual machine that runs. Let's do the simple. So you have OS running. There is a virtual machine that provides another x86. There's another real copy of the OS and apps. So there are there's a host operating system and a distinct operating system. This could be Linux, that could be Windows, one could be Mac, another could be Windows. So there are two copies of this. Okay? Here there's only one OS. All it is doing is inside this container you can say this should look like a 2.x version of the OS, or this should look like a 3.x version of the OS. That's all it's saying. So think of an OS exposing multiple system call interfaces. And you can say that container uses that version of the interface and this one. So it's the same kernel. Nothing has changed. Here you actually have full emulation of another PC, x86 and an OS running. So it's a different way of doing virtualization. So you are using one OS interface to emulate another. Here you are using one hardware interface to emulate another hardware interface. On that hardware interface, you run another OS. Okay, so that's the difference. So there are again lots of OS support for guest OS level virtualization. Solaris has this notion of containers that allow you to create these OS partitions. In BSD, you have this abstraction called a jail. Okay, you can jail a process, which means that you isolate it and you put it in its own cell. It can't see anything else. It can only see itself. No other processes are visible. Any process it starts are still visible to it, but everything else is not visible. You can also jail files, and you can only see these files, nothing else. Okay, so it's isolating the process. Linux has the same abstraction called vServers. Okay, so if you have vServer, that will allow you to basically do OS level virtualization.
So OS level virtualization, is it a rule that you have different levels of you provide different levels of isolation in the sense the hardware, the disk, the memory heap, or even the CPU has to be isolated from other things, or there can be a case where there is something shared?
The OS level virtualization, the kernel is shared, right? So So if you actually exploit a kernel bug and crash the kernel, the whole machine is going to crash. You know, hardware virtualization, if you crash that OS, the underlying OS is unmodified, right? So it's not going to be impacted. Okay, so there's a different level of isolation being provided. Okay. Last up is the application level virtualization. Here, essentially, you can get your one application interface emulating another application interface. The simplest one to think of is the Java virtual machine, so the JVM. That's basically is made to think about. Another one is Wine. If you know what Wine does, it emulates the Win32 interface. So a Windows application can run on Linux or Mac. If you get Wine, so instead of having Windows running and running applications on top, Wine is simply an implementation of the Win32 API. Okay, so you can run applications or Windows applications on top of Wine. Mac used to have this layer called Rosetta, which provided compatibility with old PowerPC application. Once they switched to Intel, you could still run your old PowerPC applications that were compiled using PowerPC instructions. What Rosetta would do is it would basically do dynamic translation at an application level of that code into x86 code. It was doing x86 PowerPC to x86 translation, but it was being done at an application level. Okay, there was no specific virtual machine being run there. It was just doing binary translation. Yes.
Is that slower compared to emulation? Or?
Yes. So that is basically equivalent to emulation, but emulation being done at a application level. Okay, the real hardware emulation is actually just emulating a real machine. Here you are simply doing translation of instructions as they execute. Okay, so I am going to show you, for those of you who have not seen virtualization, I'll show you this simple demo. So this is VMware's Fusion product. Okay. This is going to be what we will soon see as a type 2 virtualization, as we define what type 1 and type 2 are. So this is a Mac. Okay, so I have virtual machines here, so I'm going to just show you. You can start it. So I have Linux virtual machine. Okay, this is Ubuntu. Okay, it's booting now, not booting, but restarting. Okay, so it's basically allowing, so it has a x86 emulation, but virtualization, and inside that virtual machine I have Linux running. So now you can see that Linux just looks like a normal Linux running on the real hardware, except that it is running on a virtual machine, software implementation of x86, and it just looks like, once it starts running, it just looks like a normal operating system just running on real hardware and so on. Okay. So you can start this virtual machine, you can pause it, you can do whatever you want. So this is basically going to do, is the equivalent of stopping the machine. Okay. You can power cycle it in software and things like that. Okay. I assume some of you have used virtualization, so I'm not going to go too much into this demo, just to show you. Or the other thing I should mention is whatever is happening inside this virtual machine is transparent to the underlying OS. Okay, so if you look at, there are, let me just restart this. So this is full-fledged Linux running inside a virtual machine. It has its own processes. There may be dozens of those processes. Okay. They are running on the virtual machine. Okay, if you look at what is visible to the Mac cannot, the OS X cannot see any of that. It only sees the virtualization process. Okay. The actual processes that are running inside the Linux machine are completely invisible to the underlying OS. So if you look at what processes are visible, you see that VMware Fusion is running. Okay. The fact that there is Linux running and lots of processes inside that virtual machine is invisible. Okay. So the underlying OS doesn't know of their presence, it just sees one process running. That process is emulating a PC and running dozens of other processes on top of it. In fact, it's running another kernel. All of that is invisible. Okay. So you need to be aware of what you can or cannot see. Yeah, there's a question.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, I mean, when in the multiprocessor PCs, like operating systems, where so the threads that you will be emulating in as an Ubuntu. So there will be multiple threads that will be running for let's say one process. So that would be like a user thread for the Mac, is it?
Yeah. So question is, what happens in the multiprocessor world if you have multiple threads running? How are they actually mapped onto the underlying machine? That's your question, right? So what happens is, because the virtual machine is a software implementation, you have virtual CPU. Okay? The virtual CPU, you can emulate multiple virtual CPUs as well. Okay? So you will have inside a virtual machine, you may have 2 vCPUs or 4 vCPUs. It is up to the virtualization layer to decide how those vCPUs map to the physical CPU. So you can actually emulate a multi-core or a multi-processor virtual machine, still run it on a uniprocessor system. All those vCPUs will actually map onto one CPU underlying. You can have an underlying multi-processor machine, and you can have a multi-processor virtual machine. And you can have vCPUs directly mapped onto physical cores. Okay, how that mapping is done is up to the virtualization layer. But as far as the underlying OS is concerned, it doesn't see anything. Because even there may be multiple vCPUs, they're all being emulated in software. Okay, you don't see the presence of threads. Even though 2 threads may be running on 2 vCPUs, they're still invisible. Okay, the fact that your virtual machine is multiprocessor doesn't actually change the fact that what is happening inside the VM is transparent. You will not see it. Okay, because they're all happening as a software emulation.
So, when you like, well, I don't know, my experience with VMware is that if you drag something like a file from like the host operating system to the guest operating system, like it is able to convert the file system. Like, how would it do that?
Okay. So you are asking a question saying, if you actually can drag, so there's a physical machine and a virtual machine, when you drag data from one to another, how does it do the conversion? Okay? That conversion is not actually happening at the virtualization layer. VMware has additional helper tools that are running it separately. When they see that something is being moved from the physical or the virtual machine or vice versa, those helper tools actually do all of the translation, okay? And then they provide that data either to the host or the guest operating system. It's not, nothing is happening at the virtualization layer, that's written on top. Typically, if you just take any vanilla virtual machine, you wouldn't be able to do that. So they added that as a convenience feature. Any other questions? Okay. So these are the 2 types of virtualization, hardware level virtualizations, technologies that are prevalent for native virtualization. What I just showed you is referred to as type 2 virtualization. What happens in type 2 virtualization is there is a host operating system that is running on the actual hardware. In this case, there's Mac OS X running on the actual hardware. The virtualization layer runs on top of the host operating system. It runs as an application that runs on top. Inside, on top of this virtualization layer, you can create as many virtual machines as you want. Okay, you could have started 2 of these Ubuntus if you wanted to, or as many as you have resources for. Okay, so here is one virtual machine, and inside there's a guest operating system, which could be different from the host operating system. And inside the guest, there are processes running. Yeah. And these processes are not visible to the host. The host can only see this entire VM as a process, and it sees its own processes. Okay, that's basically, these would be Mac processes. This is a VMware process that's running. Okay, what's running inside? Not visible. Okay. That's type 2 virtualization, also referred to as virtualization, that your products that you run on the desktop are all type 2. In the server world, there is something called type 1 virtualization, also referred to as bare metal virtualization. Okay. In bare metal virtualization, there is no host operating system. Okay. The virtualization software actually runs on the hardware directly. So you boot up the virtualization software, it looks like a kernel of its own. Okay. So there is no real kernel. This virtualization layer acts as a kernel, and it also acts as a virtualization software to everything that runs above it. So you get rid of this host operating system entirely in the server world. You directly boot up your virtualization software because it has the same functionality as a kernel. So this acts as your kernel, and you can create virtual machines on top. In each virtual machine, you have to run an actual OS and then the application. So this picture shows you 2 virtual machines running on a bare metal hypervisor. The hypervisor is a name for the virtualization software. Okay, so this is type 1 virtualization. And then you have two VMs, one running Windows, one running Linux. This is very common in the server world. So if you buy a 16 core or a 32 core machine, sources, you will typically end up creating smaller virtual machines. Let's say a 2-core machine, virtual machine that runs on your 16 core. So you can create 8 of them, for instance. So now you look like the physical hardware has 8 servers running on it. Each looks like its own machine, each has its own OS and all. Okay? Any questions on this? Okay. So now we'll talk a little bit about how all of this virtualization technologies work. Okay? So this requires a little bit of understanding of computer architecture, okay, and some understanding of some uniprocessor OS concepts. But I will try to explain what those mean as well. So first, if you take any CPU that you have, whether it's x86, AMD, okay, typically when you have a CPU, it has this notion of protection rings. Okay, I don't know if anybody's heard of a protection ring. Okay, what protection ring is, so think of it as a mode for a CPU. Okay, the most basic CPUs will at least have 2 modes, a user mode and a kernel mode. Okay. And so what is the difference between these two? So what happens is when you are in kernel mode, you are allowed to execute any instruction that the CPU supports. Okay. When you are in user mode, you can only execute a subset of the instructions, not all of the instructions. So if you let's say your CPU has 100 instructions that it supports, 100 types of instructions. Okay. In kernel mode, you are allowed to execute any of them. Okay. In user mode, you will basically only execute a subset. Let's say you are allowed to execute 80 of those, but the other 20 are reserved only for kernel mode. Okay. You cannot execute them in user mode. Okay. And as the name suggests, the kernel mode and user mode, when the OS kernel is executing on the CPU, the kernel is actually running, the CPU mode is switched to kernel mode. Okay. When an application process is executing on the CPU, the user mode is switched to the mode is switched to user mode, CPU mode. So now you can ask, why do you need this distinction? Why do you not allow any instruction to be always executed? It so happens that there are many instructions that the CPU supports that are privileged in some shape or form, that you shouldn't let user processes execute them, or bad things will happen. Okay? Simplest example I can give you is the halt instruction. Halt instruction halts the CPU, machine stops. Okay? If you let any application unfettered access to the halt instruction, you can run a process execute halt, machine goes down. Okay? We typically don't want to let user processes access to such instructions. Okay? Other kinds of instructions are instructions that modify page tables, instructions that do directly access hardware. Okay? You don't want to give direct access to the processes because processes may have bugs. You cannot always trust them. Okay? But you assume that the kernel is a piece of software that you can always trust. Okay? So kernel always has unfettered access to this instruction. The kernel says halt. You assume that the user actually wants to halt the machine. It's not a bug. The user process says halt, you don't know whose code it is, why is it even executing such instructions. Or if it's trying to change page tables, halt is a very pathological example. If it's trying to muck around with page tables, you don't want user processes to do that. Because then one user process will get access to another user process's memory. Okay? You will have viruses looking at your browser when you're doing online banking and stealing passwords and things like that. You don't want that. You only want kernel to actually modify page tables and things like that. Right? So to ensure security and protection, you always have this division at the hardware level. Every CPU that you buy, okay, any sort of reasonable CPU, will have at least 2 modes. Okay, they're also called protection rings. Okay? The user mode and kernel mode. Okay, so you basically, Intel actually has multiple rings. So it's ring 0 is the kernel mode. It's the most privileged. Anything goes in ring 0. Any instructions ever. Ring 3 is the least protected, sort of the mode where you have the most restricted set of instructions. Okay? Now ring 1 and ring 2 allow a little more than what ring 3 does, but not as much as ring 0 does. So you can have a gradation, but you at least need these 2 modes, okay? Minimum. You can have more than them, and then you can try to see what processes to run in which. Okay? That's the architecture background. Now we'll see what this has to do with virtualization. Any questions on this? If you don't understand this, you will not understand how virtualization is going to work. Is that clear? User mode, kernel mode. Okay. So we will now look at the actual instruction. Okay, so the instructions that we want to execute in kernel mode, we'll refer to them as sensitive instructions. Those are sensitive instructions. Only the kernel is allowed to execute them. Okay, I/O, changing memory management, space tables, halt, all of these are instructions. Simple instruction like add, divide, arithmetic instruction, move, load, stores, will let anyone execute. Those are not sensitive. Okay, user processes can execute them, so can. So now, those are the sensitive instructions. And then we look at another set of instructions called privileged instructions. These are simply the instructions that cause a trap or an interrupt to occur. There are a whole set of instructions that just simply cause a trap. Okay? For a variety of reasons, saying a packet has arrived on the Ethernet card. Okay? Or you did divide by 0. That's an trap. Okay? Because that's a faulty condition. Segmentation fault. You try to execute some memory that did not belong to you, causes a trap. Okay? There are lots of instructions that also cause a trap. Those instructions will call as privileged instructions. Okay? And now I'm going to present sort of the key result that we will use for virtualization, and then I'm going to explain what that means. Right? So the result is type 1 virtualization is feasible on some CPU if the sensitive instructions are a subset of the privileged instructions. Okay? What that means is if the sensitive instructions or the instructions that execute in kernel mode are also instructions that cause traps. Okay, every sensitive instruction also causes a trap, then you can implement type 1 virtualization. Why, I will explain in just a minute, okay, but just try to understand what I'm trying to say. Okay. So what this is saying is any instruction that you execute in kernel mode, okay, you can implement type 1 virtualization if those instructions also trigger a trap. Now let me explain why that is the case. Okay. So this is a picture of type 1 virtualization. Okay. This is hardware. Okay. That is your hypervisor. That's a virtualization layer. There's a virtual machine running on top. There's an OS on that virtual machine, and there are applications on that virtual machine. Okay. Now let us ask the question: what is going to run in which mode? Okay. Let's say you have only two modes, user mode and kernel mode. Okay. Now your CPU supports precisely two modes, user and kernel. So let's ask what should run. So what mode should the hypervisor run in from a bare metal system? User mode or kernel mode? Those are your two choices.
In type 1 it should be the kernel.
Okay. Kernel mode. Anybody thinks it should run in user mode?
User
User. There are only two modes, so there can be more than two answers. Okay, so this is the type 1 hypervisor is what boots up on the machine. Okay? There's no real kernel. Okay? So it is managing all the underlying hardware on the machine. Okay? So if the type 1 hypervisor is managing underlying hardware, we will trust it, okay? Which means we will run it in kernel. Okay? So it's not user mode, unfortunately. Okay, so type 1 hypervisor runs in kernel, and it has to run in kernel mode because it is going to allocate CPU, it's going to schedule virtual machines, and so on and so. It acts like the kernel, although it also provides virtualization. Okay, it's a bare bones kernel with virtualization support. Is the way to think of a type 1 hypervisor. Okay, so that's well and good. Now. There's a virtual machine and the user processes inside that virtual machine. Okay, what mode should we run the user process in? That's clearly user mode. They should think they should run in kernel mode. So user processes run in user mode, as we always do. Okay? But here is the main thing in the middle. There's a guest operating system that is running inside a virtual machine. Okay? That's a OS kernel. If you did not have virtualization, if you had booted that kernel directly on this hardware, that kernel would run in kernel mode. And the application on top run in user mode. Now the interesting question is, the hypervisor is already running in kernel mode. The processes are running in user mode. What should that guest OS run in? What mode should it run?
User.
Okay, so people are now thinking it should be running in user mode. Okay, why should it run in user
There can
mode?
be multiple guest operating systems, so you cannot give access to direct page segmentation and all those things.
You want isolation.
Yeah, isolation.
Okay. Anybody think it should run in kernel mode? Argue against what is being said.
Well, I just have a question, because like it's, I mean, I agree that most of it should be running in user mode, but like it still needs to call traps and whatnot, so.
Okay. Yes, so the kernel still does all the things it used to do before, right? So that's true. So what should you think it should run in kernel mode? Okay. So here's the deal. So there are multiple virtual machines running. You could run arbitrary things inside the virtual machine. Okay? It is a job of the hypervisor to ensure that bad things don't happen. Okay? Because it doesn't control what is running inside the virtual machine. There could be bugs, anything could happen. Okay, if you trusted the kernel, so there are only two answers. You can either give kernel mode access to that guest OS or user mode access. So let's talk about each. So suppose you trust the guest OS, okay, and say I'm going to allow you to run in kernel mode. Now if there's a bug there and it basically causes some problem and crashes, the whole machine is going to crash. All these other virtual machines which had nothing to do with that virtual machine will also get impacted. Okay? So if you trust it, you better be sure that you can actually trust it. But you don't know what is actually going to run inside there. You're simply emulating a PC and the user decides whatever they want to run. Okay? So what that means is you probably should not trust it. Okay? So if you can allow it to run in user mode. Which basically means I don't trust this OS because I don't know what it is, what it's doing. I will be the only thing that decides what happened, meaning I being the hypervisor. So I will do kernel mode operation and the OS doesn't have to do it. Okay? Meaning it's not to be trusted. So I'm going to run in user mode. So that begs the question, that is still a valid kernel. Okay? It actually does not know it is running on a virtual machine. It just assumes because the virtual machine looks like real hardware to the OS. Okay? As was pointed out, it will still have to do whatever its OS are asking it to do. It will still have to do I/O, it will still have to modify page tables, all of the things that are expected of it still have to be done. But you have given this OS only user level access or guest level access, user mode access. So how will that work? Right? So let's say user says halt the machine, shut it down. Okay. OS says halt. User mode, can't stop the machine. Now what do we do?
You don't have to stop the underlying machine, you just have to stop that guest
Yes, you still have to do it, but you have to execute that halt instruction.
in the hypervisor. You can build a logic in the hypervisor that if there is such instruction, then that will only impact that guest OS.
Okay. So you are saying that if the OS wants to halt, then it has to ask the hypervisor to halt that virtual machine, execute that instruction. Is that what you just said, or that's not what you said? You have something to add?
Yeah, I was basically going to say the same thing, like it's basically interfacing with the hypervisor instead of directly with the hardware. So
Okay.
it gets regulated.
Okay, so basically you have something else. Yes.
So if the hypervisor is emulating the underlying hardware for the OS, so even when the OS is sending a halt instruction, it's not going directly to the hardware, it's going to the hypervisor. So like very naturally the hypervisor will have an appropriate response to that.
So when you say it's going to the hypervisor, remember this is native virtualization. So we are not doing any translation. You take an instruction, you execute it, right? So in the emulation, you could have taken halt and done something. Here you are letting whatever is running send those instructions directly to the CPU. The CPU is in user mode. The OS tries to halt. It will actually try to execute this halt instruction, okay, and then find that it cannot do anything, okay, because that's unmodified. You have not changed it. It looks like it's running on real hardware, so it feels it can halt the machine. Right? So the only way around this is if you are running in user mode and you have to execute privileged instruction, you have to ask the hypervisor to do it for you. Just as user processes ask the kernel to do trusted stuff, in this case the guest OS is going to ask the hypervisor to do these things for it, because it cannot execute it. So how is that supposed to happen? Okay. The only way it can happen is whenever you try to execute a sensitive instruction, if you cause a trap. Okay. So you try to execute halt. Okay. One of two things can happen. The CPU can ignore it, saying you're in user mode, you can't execute it, so it will not do anything. Or it will say you try to do something you are not allowed to do, I'm going to cause an interrupt and have some trusted entity look at what you try to do. So in the latter case, you will trigger a trap. So you try to execute a kernel mode instruction in user mode. If that triggers a trap, then the hypervisor starts to run, because the traps all go to the hypervisor. The hypervisor runs and it says, okay, the OS is trying to do something, let me do it on its behalf. Okay? So this is how virtualization will actually end up working. You have a guest OS. It will try to every once in a while execute kernel mode instructions. Because it's in user mode, the CPU hopefully will throw a trap. That trap will actually come to the hypervisor. If it's I/O instructions, you'll go to I/O on behalf of the guest OS. If it's memory management, change page tables, the hypervisor will do it on behalf of the guest OS, and so on and so forth. Okay? So this will only work if whenever you execute those kernel mode instructions, you cause a trap. And this is what is basically this result, which says type 1 virtualization is feasible if all those kernel mode instructions actually are privileged instruction, i.e. they cause traps. If they do not, then you cannot implement type 1 virtualization. In fact, old versions of Intel x86 CPUs actually ignored kernel mode instructions that were executed in user mode. They simply ignored them. They did not cause a trap. If you try to execute halt, it will execute as a no-op instruction, which means it won't do anything. Okay? So if you have this kind of CPU, you cannot execute type 1 virtualization, because the guest OS will try to do something and it will just get ignored. So it cannot execute whatever it's trying to do. Okay? So early versions of x86 could not do bare metal. They could only do type 2. New versions, of course, have solved that problem. Okay? So what newer versions of Intel and AMD CPUs do is there are specialized technologies called Intel VT, okay, for virtualization technologies, and AMD SCM. So what this allows you to do is it allows you to create a bit mask for an instruction, 1 bit per instruction. If the bit is set, what that says is if that instruction is executed in user mode, cause a trap. You can explicitly set bits for instruction. Because by default, the default action is you execute a kernel mode instruction in user mode, ignore. Okay? But you can set a bit saying if this instruction is executed, don't ignore, cause a trap. Okay? That's what VT does. And then so you have a hardware bitmap on what instruction to trap. So now when the hypervisor boots up, it can initialize this bit mask and say these are all the instructions that if the OS executes, then come sort of create a trap and come down.
Why is the controller setting bit mask?
Yeah, so who has the controller setting bit mask? So that should also be a privileged operation. So only the hypervisor when it boots up should do all of this. You can't let guest operating system muck around with it. Then they can cause more trouble. Is that clear? Okay. Now the other nice thing that we can also provide as a CPU designer is not just 2 modes, but at least 3 modes. Okay? Ring 0 is the most trusted kernel mode. Okay? Ring 3 is the least trusted user mode. You can actually have a middle mode which allows guest operating systems to run. Okay? That way you can distinguish between whether the halt has been called by an application, in which case you shouldn't worry about it at all, or the guest operating system in which you should actually pay attention to. Because when you are trapped into the hypervisor, you cannot tell whether some process triggered this instruction or the kernel triggered the instruction. So if you run the kernel in some middle mode, which is more trusted than user level processes, but not as trusted as the kernel mode, then you are actually going to be in the, get the best of all modes. You run all guest OSs in the middle mode, okay? Which is not as privileged as the kernel mode, but you trust it a little more than arbitrary processing.
So, I mean, when the trap goes to the hypervisor, so basically the hypervisor ensures that for the halt instruction that the virtual OS goes down, is halted, right?
In the halt instruction, the CPU stops executing.
Yeah, stops executing basically for that, only for that virtual OS.
Yes.
Right, now if we have like another ring, let's say ring 1, which allows that the virtual OS directly to halt the system, use the halt instruction. So how does, that ensures that only that the virtual operating system would the processes for that operating system will halt.
So question is, if you have a middle mode where you allow some kernel mode instructions to execute, that's your question, right? So what you do in the middle mode is not allow more instructions to be executed, but you basically let them cause a trap and you pay attention to the trap. Okay? In ring 3, if you call a halt, you will ignore it. In ring 2, if you call a halt, you will trap and you will actually process it. But all the kernel mode instruction will still be executed by the hypervisor. So not letting the middle rings execute anything, but you are actually making a distinction: should I ignore it or should I pay attention to it? That's all. Okay, so that's type 1 hypervisor. Any more questions on this? Okay, that's how you would implement bare metal. Okay, now we'll look at how to implement type 2 virtualization. It's much easier than implementing type 1 hypervisors. Okay, so what you do in this case is the host OS is already running. Okay? Host OS is going to run in ring 0. It's running in kernel mode. Okay? So now you can ask, what should this thing run in, the hypervisor? User mode, kernel mode. Okay, it should run in user mode. It's actually a process as far as the host operating system is concerned. Okay, so it's going to run in pure user mode. It has no more privileges. Okay, in this case, it had full privileges. The OS inside did not have privilege. In this case, this OS has full privileges. This has no privileges, user mode. This guest OS also has no privilege. That's also in user mode, and so are its applications. Okay. So everything is running in user mode. Okay, so now you can ask, so here the guest OS is still trying to do privileged operation. Type hypervisor has nothing it can do. It is running in a user process. Okay, so what should happen? How should all this work? Okay. So the way this works is it basically does binary translation on the fly. Okay. So what the virtualization layer is going to do is, as it loads code to execute for processes, it's going to scan the code. If it finds any kernel mode operations in the kernel's sort of set of instruction, it is going to replace them with function calls. Okay. Those function calls, so rather than actually executing a kernel mode operation, the OS will transparently now execute this function call. The function call will actually come into the virtualization layer. The virtualization will then make a system call to the actual OS on behalf of the guest operating system. Okay. So you are going to basically do binary translation on the fly. Okay. So for all of the kernel code, as the kernel executes, you scan, is there a kernel mode instruction? And you on the fly, you will replace that with a function call. Okay. So this is going to happen at runtime, completely transparent to the OS, which is why the OS is unmodified. The OS is still executing its own kernel mode instruction. But underlying, when they execute, some function call gets executed that goes to the type 2 hypervisor. The type 2 hypervisor will then make system calls. This is how, so in this case, you don't need any special hardware support. You can run type 2 hypervisors on old Intel x86. There's nothing needs to change, unlike type 1 or bare metal virtualization. Okay. So this brings us to this para-virtualization. Okay. So what para-virtualization does is, rather than scanning the kernel code at runtime and replacing every privileged or kernel mode instruction with a function call, why not actually modify the code of the operating system and have a programmer replace it one time and compile that code? Okay, so now you are basically saying we will relax the assumption that the OS is unmodified. We will have the kernel designer go and look at every kernel mode instruction that your kernel is ever going to trigger and replace them with a function call to the underlying virtual machine. So you are building a special version of your kernel that's designed solely to run on a virtualization platform, which type 2 hypervisor did on the fly. It did not require you to change anything, but scanning this code and replacing it will slow things down, as you can imagine. Before you let any instruction execute, you have to keep scanning, saying, should I replace it with a function call? Okay. So rather than doing it at runtime, you do this at code time. So you build a special version of Linux. It's a para-virtualized Linux. Every kernel mode instruction that Linux kernel would ever execute is replaced by a system call to the underlying virtual machine, the bare metal hypervisor. Okay? If you do this, then you don't need that hardware support where you have to create traps and so on, because there is nothing to worry about. You already changed all the kernel mode and replaced them with explicit calls to the underlying virtual machine layer, and ask the virtual machine to do privileged instructions on your behalf. So this is referred to as para-virtualization. So you replace all sensitive instructions with what are called hypercalls. Hypercalls are calls from the hypervisor. They are like system calls, but calls you make to a hypervisor. Any questions on this? So this is para-virtualization. It requires changes to the OS, okay, but then it allows you to run bare metal on any hardware without special support.
This is not similar type of hypervisor.
Yes, this is type 1 hypervisor. So you are actually running now on type 1 hypervisor without requiring this result. Because now even if you don't have traps, you don't care, because there will be no such instruction, because you already replaced them with function call. This is what type 2 was doing on the fly. Okay. So you can now do this on type 1, which is where you can say type 1 here, without requiring hardware support. So if you want to run a bare metal hypervisor on old hardware, the only way to do it is you have to have a para-virtualized kernel. Otherwise your same thing will not work. At type 2 you don't need any special support, it works out like
So,
this.
I mean, is it para-virtualization, is it faster than the type 1 hypervisor, I mean, the other one, the type 1 hypervisor virtualization? Because,
This one?
yes, yeah.
No, it's not faster, it's different, because if you do not have that hardware support where privilege instruction cause a trap, there is no way to implement bare metal. Para-virtualization is a way to
But
implement it and get around the problem.
If we do a performance comparison, because here basically you will have to first go to the user processor will be running, and then you have to context switch to the kernel processor that will actually do the whole process for the OS, and then again do the context switch back to the user. So there it will be more like system calls that are going. It's a stacked system call that will be going.
So question is there a performance difference between making a hypercall or execute a sensitive instruction that causes a trap? So from a performance standpoint, that's equivalent, because the way system calls are implemented, when you execute a system call, it causes a trap by definition. Okay? So hypercall will actually have the same exact effect, because by definition a hypercall means cause a trap, go to the hypervisor, hypervisor sees what is it that caused the trap or interrupt and execute whatever it's like executing interrupt service. Okay. Same happens in both cases. In one case you need hardware support, in other cases you built it in. Okay. So from a performance standpoint, there isn't a whole lot different. The main issue is whether you have the luxury of modifying the OS. You could never do this for Windows unless you have the cooperation of the vendor. In this case, Microsoft. For open source kernels, you could do it. So because you can go modify it and say you want to run bare metal, you have to boot up this kernel, which is specially modified for the purpose. Okay, but performance wise, there isn't a whole lot different. Skip this one. So I have 2 or 3 more slides and then we'll end this discussion. So I only have talked about virtualizing CPUs. Okay? All of this discussion was virtualizing one of the many components of a hardware, which is the CPU. Okay? But that's not to say that you don't virtualize the memory, disk, network and so on. You actually have to deal with them all. Okay? So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about memory and so on. Okay, so the way memory virtualization works is you have your machine, you have RAM on that machine. When you have virtual machines, you take a portion of your RAM and allocate it to each VM. Okay, let's say your 8 GB RAM. Okay? You can take 2 gigabytes and say that goes to this virtual machine. You can take another 2 gigabyte, give it to something else and so on. So you carve out your RAM and you give it to each virtual machine. Now, although that virtual machine manages the RAM allocated to it, because of all of what we have said, the kernel is not able to directly modify page tables and so on, even though that memory has been allocated to it, because those are all sensitive instructions. Okay. So every time the OS needs to make some changes for its process, you will have to trap into the underlying hypervisor and have it do those changes for you. Okay. So the way it actually works in most of this virtualization layer is the hypervisor keeps what is referred to as a shadow page table. Okay? The OS has its own page table because it doesn't even know of the presence of the hypervisor. The hypervisor has a shadow page table which is mirroring what the original page table is. Whenever the OS wants to make a change to its page table, it will trigger a trap because that's a sensitive instruction. You will come into the hypervisor will actually make modifications, the necessary modifications to the shadow page table, and since the original page table is mapped, those changes get reflected to the original page table. Okay? So this is basically a simple trick that you will have to put in place in order to make changes allow OSs to make changes transparently. You can't go into the OS code and start doing something. You have to still do it at the hypervisor level. Okay, so you use this notion of two-level mapping and shadow page tables to do memory virtualization. Okay. There is also I/O virtualization, which includes both disk and network virtualization. So what happens for disk virtualization is you basically create what are referred to as virtual disk files that look like a real disk. You create a gigantic file. Okay. You put all of the data for that OS and its application into that one file, but that entire file looks like an actual disk, okay, because it's emulated at a disk. When you read or write to the disk, you're actually reading or writing to a file as far as the underlying OS is concerned. Okay. So virtual disks are emulated as files in the underlying OS or at the hypervisor level. Okay. And you basically just emulate the sort of a code for a disk, but you simply read or write to the corresponding locations in this file. Okay. And the network is somewhat similar. We basically have, let's say, an Ethernet card here. You will emulate an Ethernet card at your virtual machine layer, and you are simply going to map them. When a packet goes out, you simply forward it to the underlying Ethernet card inside the packet. When the packet comes back, the virtualization layer keeps track of what has gone out, what are the connection mappings, and then you decide which virtual machine needs it and you forward it. Okay, because this will get its own IP address, because it has its own logical Ethernet card, which can get its own independent IP address, independent from the underlying physical interface card. Okay, so I'll just show you an example. So if you look here, you will see that there is actually the original Ethernet interface, and there are two emulated interfaces. There's a VMware as a network card 1. It's a fake network card, not a real one. It just looks like an emulated version of an Ethernet card. It has its own IP address, which is independent from the IP address of the machine. And then the virtualization layer has created this mapping. Okay, so it's emulating disks, it's emulating network, it's managing memory. So basically you're emulating all parts of the underlying machine in this case. Okay, so that's basically gist of. Okay, so I will very quickly mention application level virtualization, which basically we said JVM is the easiest way to think about application level. Okay, you all coded Java. Okay, your Java process runs on JVM, which is an abstract machine. Okay, the JVM is actually emulating a machine. Okay, but it's an abstract machine, not a real machine. It doesn't correspond to any real hardware. It's a logical machine they have defined, and your Java code runs on that logical machine. The JVM then basically emulates that logical machine using the underlying physical hardware. Whatever is being done by your Java code is being emulated and run on the physical hardware. Okay, so it's application level virtualization. So keep that in mind. I mean, you don't think of this when you execute Java code. It's actually running inside a virtual machine at the application level. Okay, so very last point I'll make in the end here is there is a lot of use of virtualization in today's world. Okay, it goes way beyond the mainframe use case that I talked about at the very beginning. Okay, you can essentially download what are called virtual machine appliances. Okay, they are pre-configured virtual machine. They have an OS and some piece of software already installed and ready to go. Okay, so you simply download the entire virtual machine and you start running it. Okay, this is becoming a new way to distribute pre-configured software. Okay, rather than getting some large piece of software, installing it and then thinking how do I configure it, get it to run. What some vendors are doing is they're basically pre-installing it inside a virtual machine. It's already configured for you. So all you need to do is download and run. So the headache of configuration is all gone. Right? Of course, it runs inside a virtual machine rather than your native machine. But if it's a complex piece of software, you don't have to worry about how to run, how to configure it in order to make it run. So if you go and look at either Amazon or VMware's marketplace, you will see that there are hundreds of virtual machine appliances. Okay, these are pre-configured, pre-populated software in the virtual machine. You simply download and you are ready to go. You can get sort of e-commerce appliances where you have a store already sort of configured and you can just use it to build a website which emulates online retail stores and things like that. So that's one way virtualization is making software deployment easier. Yet another is it's used in data centers in the server world to take machines, consolidate them on the smaller number of machines, but run them on virtual servers rather than physical servers. So you can replace 5-year-old single processor machine by a single machine that has 32 cores. Okay? Run 16 virtual machines on them, give each virtual machines 2 cores. Okay? It's still faster than your 5-year-old machine because now you have 2 cores as opposed to 1. Okay? But now you can throw away 8 machines and replace it with 1. It is much easier to manage from a hardware perspective. So that's another popular use case for virtualization. And as you replace hardware, rather than buying one replacement machine for an old machine, you buy one machine for n machines and then run virtual machines. Cloud computing we'll look at. We're actually going to do some assignments on cloud computing. It's also useful in desktop world, okay, for doing testing and development. Your development machine could be a virtual machine. You could do testing because your software is pre-configured, you load it and you test it. Even if it crashes, nothing has to change on your original machine. Okay, so lot of use of virtual machine technology in software development world, okay, for what is referred to as test and development. Okay. So with that, I'm going to end here. We'll continue some of this discussion next time. Last announcement, there's no class on Wednesday. Okay. That's the reason we had a makeup class last week on Friday. Because on Wednesday there's no class, so I'll see you all next week.